sweetheart, you know I care. Well, I think about you when you're not there. There's something, baby, I need you to see. Well, I'm going away and you don't need me. Well, you don't need me. Well, you don't need me. You don't need me. Yeah, you don't need me.
In 1997, the White Stripes formed as a quirky two-piece band from the rough suburbs of Detroit in the USA. Now they are one of the most recognised bands in the world. So just how have this supposed brother and sister gone from playing in small bars and clubs to headlining some of the biggest music festivals around the world? Is it just the red and white that's made them stand out? John Gillis, later to be known as Jack White, was born on the 9th of July 1975 to a musical family in southwest Detroit. He attended Kaztech Music College in 1992 and afterwards landed an apprenticeship at the Muldoon Studio, an upholstery shop in Detroit. In 1994, John successfully auditioned as the drummer for Goober and the Peas. It was here that the band nicknamed him Jack.
First time I came across Jack White was during the waning days of Goober and the Peas, when he was the latest in a succession of drummers that were part of that band, and he was just Jack, the new drummer in Goober and the Peas, kind of a quiet guy. And although Dan Miller, who was Goober and now works with White Stripes, at the time did make a comment about what a good musician this was. So, but nobody could have looked at this guy playing drums for Goober and the Peas and said he would become Jack White of the White Stripes.
He was playing drums with a band called Goober and the Peas, and I had seen them around that time, and I knew him through other connections with Meg and all that, and I kind of forgot he was in a band, and then he came in one night on one of our open mic nights and was playing drums, and he was really good.
While in Goober and the Peas, Jack met Meg White, a Detroit girl from the east side of town. The couple married in 1996, with Jack taking Meg's surname of White. The following year, they started the White Stripes.
The White Stripes were odd for the Detroit scene. The concept of a duo, a guitar-drum duo, was not really odd in rock and roll. There were a few of them out there. But yeah, the first thing you often heard from people who saw the White Stripes were like, oh, there's only two of them and there's no bass player and the drummer's a girl.
I remember their first show a little bit. It was actually, they may have played a couple times. I know they played at least one open mic night at the Gold Dollar, our Sunday night open mic, and it was questionable.
Nobody was like, we're going to go see the White Stripes, they're a new band. Everybody came, they were opening up, and everyone was like, oh, it's the the two-star guy, he's got a band. And they get on and they have this little podium pedestal, he put this amp on and he draped this red scarf over it, and and they had the red and white image and the candy cane on the drum kit.
I think once people figured out that this was a drummer and a guitar player, a drummer who frankly wasn't very good at that point, there was probably a sense that it was kind of gimmicky, maybe. Maybe it was sort of a whimsical side project for Jack, who was, clearly a gifted guitar player.
And I just remember that Jack had this crazy, strawberry hair, and it was really curly, and he wore it kind of high on his head, and it was definitely interesting. It doesn't look anything like he looks today.
I think the first time anybody saw the White Stripes, certainly up until their notoriety, it takes you back for a minute, and not just the duo, the concept of the duo, but it was certainly in the beginning, it was so raw and so kind of jagged, and Meg kind of chasing Jack, and Jack trying to both direct Meg and go where he wanted to go.
You think she's playing basic, simple beats now? Well, they were simpler then, and there were a lot of mistakes and tempo problems, and it's amazing she's really picked it up.
The White Stripes were just getting started, and so their whole trip was kind of interesting to all of us. There wasn't anybody, well, there was Bantam Rooster. There were bands that were doing two-piece stuff and R&B based two-piece stuff, but the White Stripes sort of had this delicate quality.
It started out as, yeah, we're just going to do this for fun, this will be interesting. And then it started picking up, and he was still doing the other projects, and then it picked up even more, I think, beyond his or anyone's conception.
At the point where everybody was kind of, being like, oh, this band's cool, and more people were coming. I remember there being a show where there were like 50 people at the Gold Dollar watching the White Stripes when they were starting to, they weren't like the first of 3 bands, they were the second of 3 bands. And them playing a show and her up really badly, and Jack getting on the mic is like, can anybody in the crowd play drums? I think I need a new drummer.
The White Stripes' hometown is Detroit in the state of Michigan, on the east side of the United States. Once a famous industrial motor town, Detroit suffered greatly in the 80s when car giants General Motors, Ford and Chrysler all relocated out of the city.
Detroit is it has a very visceral quality to it. I mean, it's built from the ground up. It's cement, it's cars, it's motor oil.
They like to suggest that the reason all this rough and tumble music comes out of this city is because it's such a mess, but the truth is most of the influences that inform the kind of music we make around here come from elsewhere.
Detroit is unique in the sense that it's a city that never recovered from the riots, so you've got a lot of low-cost housing.
You grow up in Detroit completely cynical of big business because everybody you know works for the same big businesses and gets screwed and gets laid off. And you're surrounded by total poverty that was created by big business, as like a concerted plan. And yeah, you totally grow up cynical of it all. Also, you're constantly the underdog. Everybody in Detroit is happy to be the underdog because that's what you are. And there's a romance to that.
People fight for their particular line of work, whatever it is. They take pride in what they're doing, and it's this honest approach to life.
The way Detroit affects the music that's written, I think, has a lot to do with the weather. The weather here sucks. The sky is always gray. People are agitated. I think that's a great environment for good rock and roll.
In Detroit, we already had a really solid foundation, literally going back about 40 years, with everything from the Pleasure Seekers and the Unrelated Segments to the Rationals and Bob Seger.
Everyone's aware of Motown, everyone's is aware of John Lee Hooker and a lot of the great blues, a lot of great jazz.
It's the classic northern industrial city where you had this just melting pot of people who came here to work, in this case the car industry. Inevitably they were going to want to be entertained, and inevitably the people who entertained them were going to draw on each other. So that's why at the same time right now in the 21st century we get a Kid Rock and an Eminem and a White Stripes.
In the 90s, the most influential music venue in Detroit was the Gold Dollar. Jack and Meg have often talked about how they developed their musical style and image in this much-loved venue.
The epicenter of the local music scene in general, especially any music that wasn't Kid Rock or Eminem or anything, was the Gold Dollar, which was a now defunct bar on Cass, in the heart of the Cass corridor. I saw the first White Stripes show there.
The Gold Dollar used to be a drag queen bar back, I don't know, 70s, 80s. And it closed down and Neil Yee bought it and opened it up, and it just turned into like the hip place.
Neil put people in there that were brand new or that hadn't really proven themselves. I think the White Stripes played their first show at the Gold Dollar.
During the autumn of 1997, the pair played at many of the local Detroit music venues, but their favourite haunt was still the Gold Dollar.
I started the Gold Dollar because I really wanted to have a place to put in all kinds of music that no one else would book is a large part of it. What paid the bills was the Detroit garage rock scene and that sort of thing, and some of the more out there stuff we did. We were trying to be really adventurous about it.
The Gold Dollar was dark and dingy. It was kind of your classic, grimy rock club. It was very Detroit, but it definitely became the mecca.
The attitude that I had with it is, this isn't a bar, this is a music venue. We were only open when we had shows. We were open Thursday, Friday, Saturday. For I think 3 years, I ran the open mic night on Sunday by myself there. But we were looking at it as a venue.
At the Gold Dollar, it was really this kind of open room, very open to whatever these bands wanted to play. And that it became an incubator. It really became a place for them to learn how to do what they do, to learn how to perform live, to write their songs, to try their songs out.
A lot of local bands could easily slide in because you didn't charge that much at the door. And for some reason, sometimes you've got this magical thing going on where the building has a great sound and you don't have to screw with it.
The first person to take the band more seriously was Dave Buick of Italy Records, who approached Jack and Meg about the possibility of releasing a record. The first single, Let's Shake Hands, was released towards the end of 1997, but only 500 copies of this single were initially pressed.
I remember Dave Buick, the guy who started Italy Records, saying that he came up to Jack and said, "Hey, you want to make a record? I want to put out 45 of the White Stripes," and Jack was like, "Well, I can't afford to do that." So in his mind, he hadn't even come to this point where he was thinking about making records.
When Jack first started out, those singles that he had on Italy Records, the drums were very primal, and it was probably because Meg was just learning. But because they've stuck together for so long, I could hear the development over the years.
Jack gave me the first one that they did, and I picked it up and looked at it, and I remember turning it kind of sideways to look at it, and all this stuff came pouring out, like money and little scraps of paper with little ideas and pieces of history on them, and I was like, what is this? It was like a little grab bag of interesting stuff, and it was just unusual. It was very sort of unceremoniously homemade.
It's just folk music, really. I mean, just storytelling and melody behind it, That's basically what everybody really wants to hear in the back of their head, The front part of their brain might tell them that they want something new and something electronic with a lot of gadgets and a lot of trickery, But really what their mind wants is a story, and they want to sing along with it.
By 1999, the White Stripes had cut their first self-titled album with the help from Detroit producer Jim Diamond. It was released by independent California label Sympathy for the record industry.
When I first saw Jack and Meg playing together, it was, it was kind of funny because Meg had just started playing the drums, and they were just they're about 10 years younger than I am, so they were just beating out. I think Jack is 10 years younger than I am, 9 or 10 years younger. So they were just beating out some real simple chords on the guitar and drums, and he was shrieking, and I thought it was kind of funny. He was cute. The first White Stripes record probably was, I don't know, we probably did that in, a week, 7 days, 5 days. But it was split up, so we'd come in and do all the tracks and then come back and do the mixing. But it didn't take long at all.
Jim Diamond, sort of now legendary Detroit producer, lent his hand to it, but certainly no polish whatsoever. And I think a lot of the diehard fans will tell you that, at least sentimentally, that's still the one that grabs them.
Sure, but in typical Sympathy for the Record industry fashion, I went out and bought it, rather than waiting for that company to try to send it to me. The one thing about the White Stripes very early on was, it's not that they were anti-success, but Jack in particular was so much about doing it on his own terms.
I mean, as far as Jack getting the sound that he wants, he had some ideas. He was very, self-conscious, I think, because we had to run everything. I remember we ran all the vocals through a guitar amp because he said, I don't want it to sound like it's in a studio. I said, but you're in a studio, so then you should do a live recording. So no, it was pretty easy. We had a good time together.
That first record came out, it was like, one of the first exciting Detroit bands to have a record out. There were a lot of rocker bands putting records out, but that was the first one that was kind of like truly quirky.
At that very exciting time. I think their other albums have all been very accomplished, but that was the one that sounded, because it was the first one, it sounded the freshest and the most original and the rawest. And so I felt like they did a great job and was very excited.
That first album, in a lot of points, sounded like something that was always on the verge of falling apart. In a lot of ways, that was the charm. That was kind of there was an energy, but at the same time, it was always teetering on that edge, and it gave it that sense of tension, I think, that good rock and roll has.
As far as a favorite memory recording, there's this one song on the first record where Jack rings his school bell over and over, and I really liked recording a bell. That was one of my favorite memories.
Watching her cross the street, closer to me, white face, dark hair.
The White Stripes' fame was growing rapidly within Detroit's underground music circles. Although Jack has always taken control of the band's performances, Meg's powerful role within the duo has been less understood.
Meg is shy, just like anyone would be if they were put on the spot. But I remember her, she was always the one closing the bar out at night. She was one of the last ones left every night.
Out of the whole gamut of a lot of Detroit rockers, he was the one who wasn't like, just at the bar on the weekend getting wasted or any of that. He always struck me as being very serious about being in a band, and he was one of the few people who seemed businesslike about it.
Friends of the White Stripes will tell you that Meg is a very quiet person, probably even sort of shy, but that when she does talk, Jack definitely listens.
Couple things that haven't changed. He's always been considerate, especially to bands that he invites to play with. And he's smart as hell. He knows what he's doing. He's very confident, and it shows.
As the band's reputation grew, it was ironic that bass players from across Detroit started offering their services.
There used to be talk about people would write or say, hey man, you guys need a bass player, I'll try out. People would joke, people would do that seriously. Well, hey man, where's the bass player?
Well, as the sound man, I wouldn't say they needed a bass, but I did cheat with them a little bit because I'd say on the new records and the way they play now, this guitar sound is a lot thicker. He had one amp and it was really thin sounding, and I would always actually EQ it quite a bit and do some other things to make it fuller sounding. Because you need a fuller sound. You don't necessarily need the bass, but you do need a fuller sound.
Well, the fact that they don't have a bass player really, and the fact that they've gotten away with not having a bass player, to me really isn't that surprising, because there have been other bands out of Detroit that were huge in other parts of the world. Like the Gories.
Flat Duo Jets, Phantom Rooster, the Gories, Bluesmen, controlling personalities. Those are probably all the reasons that he never got a bassist. There was already a precedent set for not needing a bassist by bands that he really liked. I think it was just part of the whole needing to control the whole product. He's always seemed really conscious of their image, even before they actually had the finances to control it as carefully as they do now.
They weren't as image conscious at first. No, I'm sure that happens to every band, where the more fame you get, the more image conscious you become. I think that's just natural. You start to feel, you notice that more people are looking at you, so you want to put on a show.
You know, on stage, those two are very color coordinated. The backdrop is often an American flag, red and white. Close friends of Jack will tell you his whole house is done up in red and white, from top to bottom, which tells you he's at least pretty dedicated to the idea.
Funny thing is, nobody ever questioned it. Everybody just got so used to seeing the red and white that nobody ever questioned it. So it developed in such a huge way that the White Stripes have actually gone beyond their colors.
Not sure how the red and white plays into their mystique on their side. I mean, in my opinion, I think it's sort of a way of keeping things honest, just as their music is as honest as it is. And there's a dualistic quality about it too. You know, the fact that it's Jack and Meg, guitar, drums, two colors, red and white. You know, they intermingle, they come apart. They can act as lines. They can mix together. They can do all these different things with just these two colors.
During this phase of the White Stripes, Jack was surprisingly also playing in the country band Two Star Tabernacle, as well as in rock combo The Go.
I first came across Jack playing in, there's another band, Two Star Tabernacle. And I saw him play live and I said, who's the guy with the split ends hairdo?
Which was a band who kind of fit into the garage scene in that they were a rock band with, you know, specific reference points. But they were definitely not part of the garage scene. And he was the guy who stood out in the band. He had a shock of curly blonde hair on the top of his hair.
Two Star Tabernacle were this kind of country-esque in the broad range of country in a city that's always had a country market but never really seemed to produce that kind of talent. So that was really kind of a groundbreaking, very original type of band.
When he was in Two Star Tabernacle, he's like, hey, this is Dan's band, I'm just playing guitar, I'm just doing this. When he played with The Go, it was kind of the same thing.
Yeah, we set up and that's exactly what comes out. We don't sit down and say, oh, we're going to write this song and you know.
And it should be like this or it should be like that. I mean, it's just, you know.
So it immediately comes out.
The Go signed an exclusive contract to the famous trend-setting indie label Sub Pop. John Troutner is the guitarist from the band and has fond memories of those days.
He had an enormous influence because up till that point we just turned into a 5-piece, so all of a sudden we sounded bigger. We wrote the songs on the first record to have big guitar solos in them, and he was perfect for the job because, of course, we all know he's a fantastic guitar player.
The Go have always sounded very much like a Detroit band. You know, The Go could have been 1969 as much as they could have been 1989, and that's a compliment.
I mean, they were the band that kind of sprung out of nowhere. They were the young kids. He wasn't in the band when they first started, and they were kind of a band that had this instant buzz around them.
In The Go, he would usually take the high part of a 3-part harmony because he could do it so easily. And I would take the low part, and Bobby would take the middle part. Worked out great.
So there was some buzz around them, and shortly before they got their Sub Pop deal, he started playing with them. But at the time, they were a band that like everybody had played in. You know, Marco from Paybacks and Rocket 455 had played with them. Matt Smith from Outrageous Cherry had played with them. I mean, they just had this revolving cast of characters. And Jack seemed like when they got in there, they solidified as a band. And he's definitely seemed like the driving force behind what they were doing, but, you know, that many stubbornly driven people in one band can't be a good thing.
Rock and roll wasn't meant to be changed, it was just meant to be made better.
In March of 2000, Jack and Meg divorced, but after only a brief musical separation, they recorded their second album, Distilled. Thanks to local boys Kid Rock and particularly Eminem, the nation's attention was now firmly on the Detroit music scene.
In terms of whether we felt like a long time had gone on between the first and second records, not really. After the first record, they were still a local band. So local bands kind of, you don't hold local bands to the same standards that you hold the national bands.
I was really impressed though when the second record came out and was called Distilled, because that's the Dutch art movement where it was all about primary colors, and it obviously has affected Jack and Meg's fashion sensibilities a lot. And it also was an art movement that was concerned with simplicity.
The second record, Jack recorded at their home, or at his home, and then we just mixed it here and did like maybe a few overdubs here.
We just write songs like the way we've always written songs. No, there was never any premeditation about it, If we went in and said we're going to make a soul record or we're going to make a country record, it'd probably be a failure in many ways, It would just let the songs come out the way they come out naturally, one by one. A different story each time, and then it'll be okay. It'll make a lot more sense than if you had all this premeditation behind it.
It was an album that could grab you on the first listen, and I think one of my favorite quotes from Jack was he said, "We were pretty angry on the first album, but that's gone. I think we've gone from anger to bitterness."
In the spring of 2001, Jack White produced Sympathetic Sounds of Detroit, a compilation album of up-and-coming Detroit bands. The Paybacks performed the first song on the album.
At the time that Jack recorded that record, the big White Stripes explosion hadn't even happened yet. And White Blood Cells hadn't come out yet. I remember looking at the artwork at his house, and it was just a cool experiment.
He knew there were a lot of great bands out here in Detroit that weren't necessarily going to get a lot of exposure, so he thought, wouldn't it be cool if we put together an all-Detroit comp of like-minded groups?
Now people look at it and they try to ascribe some kind of importance or some kind of design to it, but the reality is Jack just had the idea that it'd be kind of cool if he invited all of his friends to come up and record on the same equipment, same amplifiers, same drums, and everybody give it their best song and see what happens and see what it sounded like.
Which they ended up doing, and it was it kind of was one of the early salvos of what maybe has come to be known as the Detroit sound.
And so it was really a very innocent attempt to do something creatively interesting.
Hearing about it coming out, a lot of friends of mine were involved. There's this whole buzz about how this thing was going to make Detroit. It was going to be the next, make all these bands. And I think on many levels it did. A lot of bands that had barely been around at all at that point are now more phenomenon because of that compilation.
Jack's intention in making that record was just to get the most clear picture of each band that he could get, just something really unaffected, and he was very hands-off about it. But the interesting thing was, if you listen, there are segues in between each song that are just snippets of each band playing off-the-hook blues riffs. And that was something that he just decided in there. He said, okay, I just want you to play some blues. And everyone kind of shrugs their shoulders and looks at each other, and just any kind of blues. Just make up some silly blues riff. And it was a really revealing picture of how individual all these bands are.
The Sympathetic Sounds of Detroit album was great. It was, it was one guy's view of, hey, here's a bunch of cool bands from Detroit, and he picked an awful lot of very good bands. And it was, I remember when I first saw it, the one thing you kind of thought about was, gee, wouldn't it be great if this did come out on a major label so you could flash it in front of people and it would get that kind of distribution.
After the Distilled album, the White Stripes became one of the most popular musical attractions on the Detroit circuit.
We opened up for the White Stripes, and it was our very first show. And I loved that band. I thought they were great. And the first thing I said to Jack White, I complimented him on his red pants.
I remember, from the first time they played there and Meg just kind of looking confused. She always has that kind of look kind of going on, but not really. But she was really looking confused with first setting up the drums. Obviously it's Jack setting everything up, who knows where everything goes. And it was clear at the beginning that he was directing every move on it. And it was interesting seeing her actually learn and pick that up.
While playing a gig at the Magic Stick for a small audience, back when nobody knew who they were, he stormed off the stage because the light wasn't properly, it wasn't the way he wanted it. You can connect that to something that happened this year at a huge rock festival in California at Coachella when in front of about 40,000 people, he threw something of a mini tantrum on stage because the mix wasn't perfect on stage. So Jack's definitely a guy who cares about how the music's coming off.
He has a microphone in front of the drum kit that has some sort of processing with an old school head on the mic, and then he has another regular microphone facing the crowd, and he would leap back and forth between these two mics while slashing away at his guitar, just playing these sort of primal, garage punk blues riffs, while kind of yowling in his voice, which has been described to be half Robert Plant, half Howlin' Wolf. I don't know, all these different comparisons.
It was a mix of Robert Smith and Ethel Merman or something. He would screech and he was doing stuff that I think most people would be totally scared to do. Crazy falsettos and vibrato, like at the end of Let's Shake Hands.
And holding it all down, Sand's bass player is Meg. With just sort of, she's pounding on the drums in a way, and it's not technically efficient, but she's keeping the rhythm, and she's watching Jack with this rapt attention, and just as he is, looking at her often more than he's looking at the crowd.
It was clear that Jack and Meg were very tuned into each other, but in the beginning, she used to operate very much off of cues that he would give her, and you could see he would make little counts. He would do little gestures that were counting gestures, and I remember picking up on that right away and thinking how amazing that was.
So they have their own individual kind of communication that you definitely see in concert, and you certainly feel in the music. You do feel her responding to him. And really in the last couple of years, you've also started, I think, to hear Jack respond to things that Meg does. I think Meg has developed a confidence to play something, that just comes into her head, and then Jack will gleefully respond to that.
The intuition with the two of them and the kind of natural exchange has become so much more natural, and it's loose, but it's tight at the same time, which is always, when a band can pull that off, that's it. That's sort of what it's all about in rock and roll.
I was watching him from the stage, and the crowd was singing along with the words. And I was just in awe. I was amazed because I was like, wow, they're really they're really hypnotizing this town with their music, and it's working. It sounds great. And after the show, I talked to him, he was just as amazed as I was. He goes, I can't believe they were singing the song, you know? And we were all really happy, so it was sort of like good for all of us when that happened, because it was just like, someone is finally getting through to everybody.
The White Stripes recorded their third album, White Blood Cells, in Memphis, Tennessee in early 2001. Although they decided to record the album away from home, when it came to the release party, there was only one place to go, the Gold Dollar in Detroit City.
It was a 3-night release for White Blood Cells, and we did the first night of it, and seeing the place that filled up, and I mean, they did a 2-night once also, 2 nights in a row at the Gold Dollar. And that was sold out. And then, yeah, that record release was just amazing.
White Blood Cells was actually recorded in Memphis in a big studio on a 24-track board. Probably didn't use nearly all of those tracks because I think that the mandate from Jack to the album's engineer was, we still want this to sound like it was recorded in a bedroom.
The White Blood Cells album, I would say, was probably the most commercial of the first 3, and brought them to the mass appeal that they have now. I think they would have stayed very much underground if they kept the sound of the original 2 albums, but they started to have a more commercial sound, but again, which was so important, keeping that energy and that kind of White Stripes sound, which to me is totally unique.
The White Blood Cells album, of course, came along with the setup. You know, the Rolling Stones, you know, one of the 10 bands to watch this year. And that created a whole different aura around that album. People I think, certainly, and especially outside of Detroit, were just discovering the White Stripes, so they just began listening to it a little closer.
To me, White Blood Cells has this sense of confidence that almost oozes off the disc. You can hear a real sense of sureness in the playing and in the songwriting. And in a way, it's not surprising that that was the album that finally broke these guys.
It has a real childlike quality in some of the songs, but then there's these sort of moments of you know, sonic fury, you know, just slashing away at this guitar, and the production's really great in that record too. I mean, for just a duo, they still sound like a duo, but there's just a really great roaring guitar sound in all of Jack's guitar playing that I think a lot of people latch onto.
One of the singles that came off that album, Fell in Love with a Girl, which is just an absolutely brilliant, almost like punkish 90-second pop record. And the sort of thing that our DJs put on down here on like Friday and Saturday nights, and people just go absolutely nuts. You still get people saying, oh, God, who's that record? Who's that by? But as soon as they know it is, you know, they become converted like me and go out and buy it. It's a great, great record.
You're so sweet and you know I care. Well, I think about you when you're not there. There's something, baby, I need you to see. Well, I'm going away. You don't need.
In the summer of 2001, Great Britain caught White Stripes fever. They were enthusiastically introduced to the British public by influential BBC radio jock John Peel, who compared their importance on the music scene to that of Jimi Hendrix and the Sex Pistols.
It's hard to know what to do with a compliment like that. Your first reaction is, of course, no, it's wrong. You know, they're wrong, and we're being labeled improperly with so much, you know, hyperbole, you know. But what can you do? It's like if your dad pats you on the back and says, hey, you're doing a good job, son. It might be a different story than when, you know, 100,000 people are patting you on the back or something, or whatever it is. How many people read those things, I don't know. So it's hard to understand. It's hard to enjoy it, really. I just decide not to enjoy it and don't even think about it. Like I said, if I thought about that too much, you know, it'd make
too much pressure on you.
I can say that when I heard the White Stripes were winning the favor of John Peel and had done 2 initial sessions, you knew it was going to take off from there.
Well, I'd finally gotten high-speed internet at my house, and so I'm flipping through and I'm going, okay, internet radio, let's see what's on, and I'm thinking, okay, we'll listen to whatever's there, and I switch on to BBC One, and it's John Peel doing a show, Detroit special show, an entire hour or something about Detroit music, and they started talking about the gold dollar in the first 10 minutes of my internet radio experience, and I thought, there really is no escape.
Their first UK gig was at the 100 Club on London's famous Oxford Street.
The first time I came across the White Stripes was when Metropolis Music called me and asked me to put a date into the diary for them. And to be honest with you, even though I like to think that I've got my nose to the ground, I'd never heard of them. I'd never heard of them. And then gradually, as the date got nearer and nearer and nearer, it was quite obvious that they were going to be absolutely enormous. The impact of the show here was huge. It's the only show, probably other than the Oasis one that we've done recently, where we could have sold it out 4 or 5 times over. The interest was absolutely phenomenal. They were both, as you would imagine a lot of Americans to be, they're very, very talkative, very, very interested in the club. Jack quite obviously knew a lot about the club. He'd heard about one of his idols, Son House, playing here in 1970 and recording an album down here, and was very knowledgeable about the club. And I got the sense that he was genuinely felt quite honoured to play here. I know that probably sounds a bit sort of pretentious on our part, but Jack did seem as if he really did want to be here. Meg was very quiet and very shy. She was very polite and nice, but Jack obviously knew the place.
I've been working so hard for your loving. Love is here, well it's killing me.
Because he walked through the door, and he literally had 2 guitars and an amp, plonked them on the stage, and that was it. There was no back line, there was no special. I think he had an effects pedal, but other than that, that was it. The kick came in for Meg, and that's how they played the whole gig right the way through, which was completely unheard of at the time.
Shake, shake, shake.
The atmosphere was absolutely electric. I think the White Stripes gig here will go down as one of those were you at gigs kind of thing, like the Stones has done over here, the 2 Stones shows that we did, the Sex Pistols show, the Oasis show. I think that the White Stripes gig genuinely will go down as one of those I wish I'd been there shows. The atmosphere was fantastic. I mean, you just felt that there was something magic about this band, and that this band were going to be absolutely enormous. I mean, some people have got it and some people haven't. And as a front man, Jack's remarkable really. He's a brilliant musician, but as a front man, quite incredible.
We're brother and sister. We grew up together, and that was only relationship we had besides that before the band. So Meg had never played before when we started playing together. It was just sort of a lark. It just seemed to work out well. It was real childish and very primitive. So we just kind of continued working on it and see if anything good would come out of it, any good songs, and try to make some 7-inch records together and see. That was just really the most exciting part.
Jack White still introduces Meg as his sister, even if we all know they are ex-husband and wife. Although Jack dismisses media attention on his private life, the White Stripes have had a love-hate relationship with the press.
The White Stripes have always been good about creating stuff to talk about, whether they're husband and wife, brother and sister, divorced, what's they steal, why do they wear red and white, what's Jack's hair look like. That's one thing they're good at. For a group that really doesn't court the attention, they've always been good at just creating stuff to talk about, and that's part of the magic of them too.
When the Detroit Free Press revealed publicly the story of Meg and Jack's real relationship, which was the fact that they were indeed divorcees and not brother and sister, I don't think Jack was real happy about it. He got up on stage that night, and the theme of that show was essentially the Detroit Free Press sucks.
Although the Detroit Free Press were the first organisation to announce the real Jack and Meg relationship, the Glorious Noise website was the first one to announce it to the world.
I guess the idea behind putting the wedding certificate online on the site for Glorious Noise came about through sort of these email arguments that would transpire between myself and the editor-in-chief and various other contributors, trying to decide whether it was a good idea to put it on there. But we liked the idea of doing it for the same reasons I was talking about, that we wanted to cover the band and their music. We also wanted to cover the hype behind the band, and the fact that their wedding certificate was readily available, in the Coleman Young building in Detroit for $15 or so. We could simply go down and get it. We figured, why not put it on the site?
The brother-sister thing has always confused me, and it's always hard to tell. I have never been able to actually go with that because, I know Jack through Meg, and I know Meg through her sister. To me, I don't know. It doesn't bother me. I think it's kind of funny. It's like everyone has to play some game, and I think it actually helps to have some question about it.
The brother-sister mythology was something that seemed to be part of their shtick pretty early on. Not clear how seriously everyone was supposed to take it. Around town, it was pretty common knowledge what the real relationship was between these two. Everybody who went to watch the White Stripes show were White Stripes friends,
With the White Stripes, it was an interesting situation where you had a band that was a really great band. Straight up, if you remove all the hype away from the White Stripes, they're a great, great band.
I really think that it wasn't a big deal for them. It was just something fun, and people got all bent out of shape and blew it all out of proportion, and the press seized on it. But there are people that would try to suggest that Jack manufactured that, for some ulterior purpose, and I assure you that is not the case.
Towards the end of 2001, Jack and Meg received a call from V2 Records. The White Stripes agreed to an unusually generous contract that let them retain controlling rights to their past and future work. V2 re-released White Blood Cells and, bolstered by a well-timed marketing campaign, sold nearly 1 million copies worldwide.
They managed to grab a really nice record deal, very unusual kind of contract that gave Jack a control that most artists in that position don't get. Usually when you sign a record deal, you give up the rights to the master recordings. The record label owns them at that point. He not only kept the rights to his own stuff, he managed to get his own boutique record label out of the deal and pretty much retained creative control.
Any good artist would say, oh, I want to, retain rights to all the masters and do things like that. I think most people that I deal with are probably too smart to let these things get away from them. They say, oh, sure, you can have the publishing. It's not like the old days where they'd say, oh, I'm broke, give me $50, okay, sign away this song.
Well, keep in mind, Jack White may have his bohemian side, but he's run his own businesses. Comes from a good family, a smart family. He is no dummy. He knows how to cut himself a good deal. So he essentially, to my understanding, has a distribution deal through V2, but Third Man is its own entity. Third Man owns what it does. The direct creative has creative control over what it does, and gives it to this larger label to take advantage of its distribution.
On his previous trips to London, Jack had met up with Liam Watson, whose band had supported the White Stripes in the past.
The first contact I had with the band was when they played at the 100 Club, and a group that I am in played with them, opened up for them, and we met, when we got there, Jack and Meg were there, we got introduced to them.
What had caught Jack's eye was Liam's unusual recording facilities at Toe Rag Studios, which featured an eclectic mix of 70s and 80s equipment. As 2002 drew to a close, Jack and Meg returned to London to start work on their next album, Elephant. Toe Rag Studios was their destination.
The recording of Elephant, was... we booked a kind of period of about 2 weeks, of which, there was some time off during that 2 weeks to do gigs and stuff. And then there was a short session, sort of about 3 or 4 months before we started doing Elephant proper. There was a session that we did one evening, where we did the song that ends the album.
I know that John Szymanski, our bass player, turned him on to Liam, the guy who runs Toe Rag.
Jack seemed to be pretty excited, by the way the studio was. Came in, saw all the old gear, and was like, oh, great, there's nowhere like this in Detroit. Well, they like the way the studio set up. I mean, this studio is a kind of particular type of studio. The reason being is because, the way I like to record, and I think the way that the best records have been made is with this kind of setup, which some people might call like limitations or restrictions. And I think that's the same way that they feel.
I think they start to see all the other options available in the world, and you want to experiment and try different things. And I can never blame an artist for wanting that, because I'd probably want to do the same thing sometimes.
The world's press have been slightly misled by, I don't know where, there's some press release from somewhere, had said something like that all the gear was from like pre-1963, well that's like rubbish, I do have stuff from before 63, like this desk for instance here, but I didn't use that on Elephant. I used this desk here, which is, it's a bit of a custom job now, this desk, because I've kind of like put various different things, but originally this desk was from like 1981 or something, which isn't particularly 1963,
I think they went to England and to Toe Rag just out of pure adventure, and Jack loved the room. He loved all the vintage gear. He loved the limited number of tracks and the challenge that presents, and it was just the kind of room that totally appealed to his aesthetic.
And we'd kind of been settled in for a couple of days, and then we were doing Ball and Biscuit, and Jack's kind of interested in things I'm doing on the desk, and I'm sort of showing him various things, and because that's got that quite sort of heavy kind of drum beat on it. So I was, when they were kind of running through it and I was in here, I was kind of playing around with compressors on the desk and kind of making it sound stupid, And that was good fun, because then of course they come in and I play it to them like really loud and sounding a bit pretty heavy, and oh wow, and they loved that. So that was kind of good fun,
Elephant is the album that finds the White Stripes dabbling in a few different musical areas. You've got vocal harmonies, you've got the sound of a bass, you've got a guest singer.
I got a call from Jack saying, we'd like to come in the studio tonight, would that be possible? And, just luckily enough I wasn't busy, so I said, yeah, sure, And that was good fun, because they came down and Holly was with them, and Bruce, who's a good friend of us all, he's in my group as well. And so it was kind of, a bit of fun really. I think Jack had written that song, earlier on in the day, and then wanted to come in just to try out the studio really. So I put them in there and sat them in a circle next to each other, and then that, then kind of rolled, got the sound up, and yeah, it was good fun. And that was it. Then Jack added a piano and a bit of percussion or whatever, and then we mixed it in about 10 minutes, and the whole thing was done in about 2 hours or something.
I thought Elephant was a masterpiece from the very beginning of Seven Nation Army. That first, the bass tone his guitar, and I just said, yeah, you could tell this was for keeps. And not that the other albums weren't approached seriously, but I think they certainly went into the studio, if not feeling pressured, then knowing that this was an album that was going to be not just looked at and scrutinized by the press, but would probably be bought by an audience that had just heard about the White Stripes.
They were quite interested in the tape editing that I was doing on the record, you know, with the razor blade and the pencil, and so Meg was quite interested having a look, you know, and I said, oh, yeah, you can do one if you want, you know, so I got her to edit one of the songs, you know, and she liked that, you know, that was good. So I showed her how to do it and said, no, you can do it, you know. She did a good job, you know. I think there's a future for Meg in editing, you know, if she decides to give up the drumming, you know.
The album hit the stores in April 2003 to fantastic reviews and massive sales. Although the White Stripes had a record deal with a large record company, Jack White stayed very much in control of Elephant.
His last record, he didn't send out any CD promos. He sent out only vinyl promos because, as quoted in Interview magazine, he said that he doesn't want any critics reviewing the record who don't own record players. That's the ballsiest thing I've ever heard anybody do.
I first got the Elephant album on the 2 promotional vinyl discs that, you know, and just cracked up when it came, because it's like, oh my God, what are we doing here? You know, I had to take everything off my turntable. It was piled up on top of it, because I long ago really stopped using it actively.
I think we've always been the most comfortable playing live. It was just a matter of seeing how we liked actually doing festivals, and the change between that and doing like a more intimate, you know, kind of atmosphere in clubs. So, but I mean, it's gone pretty good so far. I mean, we kind of didn't expect it would, but I mean, it's pretty good. So, it's changing our minds on festivals a little bit.
The White Stripes have always stayed true to their hometown and their friends. On their last tour, Jack asked his old band, The Go, to be his support act.
This past tour with the White Stripes, we did 6 shows. They were very regimented. Everything was timed perfectly. Jack's whole crew was like dressed to the nines, and we walked in and we're used to like dropping our equipment in some small crap hole club and, you know, going to find a pizza, but, you know, they had a catering, you know, unit all laid out.
Yeah, I did go to the show a few weeks ago at Masonic Temple. I went with Heather and Meg's sister and their mom. That was fun. But it was really neat seeing him at a big venue with, you know, 14-year-old girls screaming for Jack White. That was weird.
It was funny when they opened the doors. I thought back, I'm like, okay, there was that one, the first night I saw them with just the sound guy. Now I have to watch myself so I'm not trampled by these 14-year-old girls running to get to the front of the stage. I was amazed. It was pretty incredible.
So, with worldwide success under their belt, what is the future of the White Stripes?
I really don't know what the future holds for the White Stripes, but I suspect that it's going to be creatively compelling.
I think there's probably a limited time that's, you know, where you can take the duo, but I'm sure they'll, you know, have things to do musically.
I can definitely see Jack taking on other projects. I see other opportunities obviously open up to Meg. But I think that regardless of the fame and everything, as long as they maintain a good working relationship, and it's obvious that they have made it work, that there's no reason for them to stop.
Jack came out and said, you know, another album and we're gone, which is funny because he didn't say that, but he was quoted as saying that by Mojo, and now finds himself reacting to having predicted the demise of the White Stripes.
The problem is, you know, there's not a lot you can do with just the guitar and just the drum kit and vocals. I would think that the White Stripes will probably try to sort of subtly change their music as they have done from the word go.
The songs have developed, they've changed, and I think a band can survive just from that alone, from changing.
The White Stripes phenomenon has only been with us for the last few years, yet their influence on how other bands make music has been enormous.
I think that Jack has this grand plan in his head for this continuum of the band, a beginning and an end. And maybe their explosion of popularity has sort of thrown a wrench into that plan, but I think he'll stick to it.
It's hard to tell what the future holds for this remarkable duo from Detroit City. But Meg and Jack's influence on our lives seems set to continue well into the future.